This 1899 portrait of a mother and her daughter looks innocent at first, until you notice what is hidden in her lap. On March 15, 2024, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a senior curator at the Boston Historical Society, got a routine delivery that would completely change her understanding of post-Civil War Black American history. The item was a single album and print photograph, measuring 8 by 10 inches, housed in a worn, cardboard box from an estate sale in Worcester County, Massachusetts. The photograph showed a black family portrait from 1899. A mother sat in the center with 3 daughters around her. At first look, it seemed like a usual studio portrait of that time, important mostly because of its rarity. Photographs of African American families from this period are not common in historical records, making any such find very valuable for research. Dr. Mitchell had been checking 19th century photographs for 17 years. Her method was careful and complete. She started by looking at the paper stock, the mounting way, and the chemical makeup of the print itself. The album process, common between 1850 and 1890, involved coating paper with egg whites before adding light-sensitive silver salts. This particular print showed the usual yellowing and fine cracking that fit with real period photographs. The studio backdrop, a painted pastoral scene, matched the styles of the time. The subject's clothing fit with fashion trends of the late 1890s. The mother wore a high-collared black dress with lace details at the throat and cuffs. Her 3 daughters, aged about 7, 11, and 14, wore simpler cotton dresses, suitable for their ages and the family's way. Ain's apparent economic situation. What made Dr. Mitchell stop, however, was the mother's expression. Unlike typical Victorian portrait subjects, who keep neutral or pleasant looks, this woman's face showed something different, a tiredness perhaps, or planned defiance. Her posture was stiff, her hands placed carefully in her lap, partly covered by the dark fabric of her dress. Dr. Mitchell took her professional-grade magnifying glass and put the photograph under the high-intensity examination lamp. She worked step by step, scanning from left to right, top to bottom, noting every detail. The daughters' faces showed the expected nervousness of children sitting for formal portraits. The studio furniture looked standard for the period. The painted backdrop showed rolling hills and distant trees, a common choice meant to suggest nice living and peaceful country life. Then she saw it. Partly hidden beneath the dark folds of fabric in the mother's lap, barely visible even under magnification, was the clear outline of a small revolver. The metal caught the studio light in a way that the surrounding fabric did not, creating a slight but definite contrast. The weapon cylinder was visible, as was part of the grip. It had been placed on purpose, hidden enough not to stand out in the image, but clear enough to be found by close examination. Dr. Mitchell's breath caught. She adjusted the magnification and moved the light source again. There was no doubt. This woman had purposely hidden a weapon in her lap while sitting for a formal family portrait. And somehow, the photographer had either not noticed or had chosen not to say anything. The implications were big. Family portraits in the Victorian era were costly, formal events. Subjects dressed in their best clothes, traveled to professional studios, and stayed perfectly still for long exposures. Every part was carefully managed. For a weapon to show up in such a photograph, even partly hidden, suggested it was done on purpose. But why? What conditions would make a black mother in 1899 feel the need to be armed, even during a formal family portrait? Dr. Mitchell knew she had found something far more important than a strange photographic detail. This image was a historical record that needed deep study. Dr. Mitchell quickly recorded her finding with high-resolution digital photography, capturing the revolver's outline from many angles, under different lighting conditions. She made a detailed examination report, noting the weapon's approximate size, position, and the fact that it appeared to be a small-caliber revolver, like models available in the 1890s. She then started the careful process of identifying the people in the photograph and understanding the situation in which it was taken. The back of the photograph had a studio mark pressed into the mounting board, J. R. Thompson Photographic Studio, Worcester, Massachusetts. Below this, a handwritten note in faded brown ink read, Mrs. Eleanor and Daughters, September 1899. No last name was given, which was not unusual for photographs of black subjects during this period. It showed the unfair way records were kept at that time. White subjects were usually identified with full names and sometimes addresses. Black subjects were often listed with only first names or general descriptions. Dr. Mitchell contacted the Worcester Historical Museum, giving them high-resolution copies of the photograph and asking for access to any records related to J.R. Thompson's studio. Within 3 days, archivist Marcus Washington replied with early findings. Thompson had run his photography studio from 1892 to 1907 on Main Street in downtown Worcester, serving both white and black clients. A fairly open practice for the time, though his black clients were usually booked at different hours to avoid upsetting white customers. Most of Thompson's business records had been lost to a fire in 1910 that destroyed the building where his studio had been. However, the Worcester Historical Museum had kept several ledgers and a partial client list from the late 1890s, given by Thompson's grandson in the 1960s. These documents had been listed, but never studied closely. The name Eleanor appeared twice in the September 1899 ledger. One entry was identified by full name and address: Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, 45 Highland Street, a white family from a well-off neighborhood. The second entry, dated September 12, 1899, listed only Eleanor, colored with no address provided. The fee recorded was $1.50, which was standard for a family portrait of this type. A note in the margin read, 6 prints requested, which was not common. Most clients ordered 1 or 2 copies. 6 prints suggested the photographs were meant for sharing. Dr. Mitchell widened her search to census records, church registries, property deeds, and tax records from Worcester County during the 1890s. The 1900 federal census, done just months after the photograph was taken, listed several black families in Worcester. The total black population of the city was about 600 people out of a total population of over 118,000. Among the black households listed in the census was one headed by Eleanor, age 38, listed as Negro under the race category. Her occupation was recorded as seamstress. Living with her were 3 daughters: Ruth, age 14, Grace, age 11, and Clara, age 7. The ages match the apparent ages of the girls in the photograph. Most importantly, the census showed that Eleanor owned her home free, meaning without a mortgage, a remarkable achievement for any woman in 1899, and especially for a black woman. Dr. St. Mitchell checked the census data with Worcester property records. She found a deed dated March 1895, transferring ownership of a small house at 47 Cedar Street from a white family named Patterson to Eleanor, Negro woman, spinster. The purchase price was $800, paid in full at the time of transfer. Property tax records showed Eleanor had paid her taxes regularly and on time from 1895 through 1900. For a black woman to own property outright during this period was very unusual and would have drawn attention, not all of it positive. Dr. Mitchell traveled to Worcester to do research in person. The Worcester Public Library kept an extensive archive of local newspapers on microfilm, including complete sets of the Worcester Daily Gazette and the Worcester Evening Post from the 1890s. She spent 3 full days going through editions from 1897 to 1900, looking for any mention of black families, Cedar Street, or incidents of racial violence. The Worcester Daily Gazette archives contained several references to racial tensions during this period. The tone of the coverage showed the strong racism of the era, but the facts were recorded clearly enough to understand what had been happening in the city. The first important article, dated April 23, 1897, was headlined, "Citizens Organized to Preserve Neighborhood Character." The article described the formation of a committee of white residents worried about the late arrival of colored families into respectable areas. The committee chairman, identified as Thomas Bradford, a local businessman and property owner, was quoted a lot. "The presence of colored residents in traditionally white neighborhoods threatens property values and disrupts the social fabric of our community. These people, however well-meaning individually, do not belong among us. We will take all necessary and legal measures to preserve our neighborhoods for the families who built them. The article listed several streets where black families had recently bought homes, including Cedar Street. It noted that property values on these streets had gone down as a result, though no actual data was provided to support this claim. The committee announced its plan to encourage black homeowners to sell their properties and move to more suitable areas of the city. A second article dated November 7, 1898, reported an incident of arson. A house on Cedar Street, owned by a black family, had burned during the night, under what the article called mysterious circumstances. The family, a couple with 2 young children, had escaped unharmed, but had lost all their possessions. The husband told the newspaper that he had received threatening letters before the fire, warning him to leave the neighborhood. The police investigation, according to the article, decided the fire had been caused by an overturned lamp, despite the family's claim that they had been asleep and no lamps had been lit. Witnesses reported seeing several white men near the property shortly before flames were seized, but no arrests were made. The family left Worcester within a week of the fire. The third article, published October 22, 1899, just 6 weeks after Eleanor's photograph was taken, described growing tensions on Cedar Street. The headline read, "Colored Seamstress Defies Neighborhood Committee." According to the report, several black homeowners on Cedar Street had received letters demanding they sell their properties and leave Worcester. Most had agreed, selling at big losses. However, the colored seamstress at number 47 had refused all offers and had reportedly told neighbors she would not be scared. The article quoted an unnamed member of the Citizens Committee saying, "This woman's stubbornness is causing unnecessary conflict. She would be wise to accept a fair price for her property and move on before the situation gets worse." Dr. Mitchell photographed each article and checked the dates with other records. The pattern was clear. Black homeowners in Worcester faced planned harassment, threats, and violence meant to force them out of neighborhoods where white residents did not want them. And Eleanor, the woman in the photograph, had been specifically named in the newspaper as someone who refused to leave. Now, Dr. Mitchell understood the situation in which the photograph had been taken. This was not simply a family portrait. It was a record created during a time of real danger. The revolver in Eleanor's lap was not a mistake or a curious detail. It was a clear statement, a visual record of her decision to defend herself and her daughters against very real threats. Dr. Mitchell returned to Boston and immediately started looking for descendants of Eleanor and her daughters. She contacted several genealogical societies specializing in African American family history, posted questions on academic forums focused on post-Civil War black communities in New England, and reached out to churches in Worcester and Boston that had served black Kizan congregations in the early 1900s. Within a week, on March 28, 2024, she received an email that would open the case. The sender was Patricia Johnson, a 67-year-old retired teacher living in Springfield, Massachusetts. Her message was short but exciting. "I believe the woman in that photograph you're researching is my great-great-grandmother. Her name was Eleanor, and my family has always been told she was a woman who refused to run. I have documents and another photograph that might help your research. Can we meet?" Dr. Mitchell replied right away, and they arranged to meet at the Boston Historical Society the following afternoon. Patricia arrived carrying a worn leather portfolio that had belonged to her grandmother. She was a tall woman with silver hair, dressed nicely, and she moved with quiet dignity. When Dr. Mitchell showed her the 1899 photograph on a higher resolution monitor, Patricia stared at it for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "That's her," Patricia said softly. "That's Eleanor, and those are her daughters, Ruth, Grace, and Clara. Clara was my great-grandmother. She was the only one who lived long enough for me to know her personally. She died in 1984 when I was 27 years old." Patricia opened the leather portfolio carefully. Inside were several documents preserved in archival plastic sleeves: birth certificates, a family Bible with handwritten genealogical records dating back to the 1850s, several letters, and one additional photograph. a formal portrait of an elderly black woman taken in what appeared to be the 1920s or early 1930s. On the back, in careful handwriting, someone had written, Eleanor, age 67, Boston, 1927. Dr. Wold. Mitchell examined the later photograph closely. The woman was clearly much older, her face lined with age, her hair completely white, but the resemblance was clear. The same strong bone structure, the same sharp gaze, the same set to her jaw that showed determination and quiet strength. This was Eleanor, nearly 3 decades after the 1899 photograph, having survived whatever threats she had faced. She lived until 1932, Patricia explained. She died during the Depression, at 71 years old. My great-grandmother Clara was with her at the end. Before Grandma Clara passed away in 1984, she told me stories about her mother, about Eleanor's strength, her courage, and what the family went through in Worcester. Patricia arranged several documents on the table. My grandmother told me that Eleanor had been born into slavery in Virginia in 1861, just before the Civil War started. She was freed as a small child when the war ended, though her mother had died during the conflict. Eleanor made her way north as a teenager, working as a domestic servant, first in Richmond, then in Baltimore, and finally in Boston. She learned to sew, became skilled at dressmaking, and eventually saved enough money to start her own business. Dr. Mitchell listened carefully, taking notes. When did she move to Worcester? In 1892 or 1893. I think she had heard there were opportunities there for skilled seamstresses, wealthy families who wanted custom dresses. She built up a clientele among white middle-class women. The work was steady and paid well enough that she could save money. In 1895, she bought that house on Cedar Street. It was the proudest achievement of her life. Patricia's voice grew heavier, but buying that house also made her a target. Patricia carefully removed a bundle of letters from the portfolio, tied with a faded blue ribbon. These belonged to Eleanor. My grandmother kept them her entire life, and passed them to my mother, who gave them to me. I think you need to see them. Dr. Mitchell put on white cotton conservation gloves and gently took the bundle. The letters were written on cheap paper that had yellowed and become brittle with age. She untied the ribbon carefully and unfolded the first letter. It was dated August 12, 1899, written in rough cursive, with several misspellings. The letter had no greeting and was unsigned, but its message was chillingly clear. You have been warned. Colored people do not belong on Cedar Street. This is a white neighborhood for decent families. Sell your property and leave Worcester, or you will face consequences. Your stubbornness puts your children in danger. We are giving you 1 month to make arrangements. This is your final notice before we take action. Dr. Mitchell felt a chill reading the words. This was not a vague threat. It was a specific warning, with a deadline. She carefully set the letter aside and picked up the second one, dated August 20th, 1899. This letter was even more direct and upsetting. It described in graphic, violent detail what would happen to Eleanor and her daughters if she did not agree to leave. The language was deliberately designed to scare, mentioning both sexual violence and murder. Dr. Mitchell read it once, documented it with photos, and set it aside without reading it aloud. Some historical documents were too painful to repeat word for word. The third document in the bundle was different. It was written in Eleanor's own hand. The script was educated and careful, the spelling perfect, the language formal and thoughtful. It was dated September 3, 1899, just 9 days before the photograph was taken. The letter was addressed to whom it may concern, and stated, I am Eleanor, a free woman, a citizen, and a property owner in the city of Worcester, Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I have broken no laws. I pay my taxes in full and on time. I conduct my business honestly. I raise my daughters to be respectable, hard-working, and God-fearing. I will not be driven from my home by threats, intimidation, or violence. I have taken lawful measures to protect myself and my family. Any man who comes to my door with ill intent will be met with appropriate resistance. I am prepared to defend what is mine. This house was purchased with money I earned through my own labor. It is my daughter's inheritance, their security, their future. I will not surrender it to terror. Let it be known that I stand my ground. Dr. Mitchell read the letter twice, feeling the power of Eleanor's words across 125 years of history. This was not just defiance. It was a formal statement, a legal and moral claim of her rights as a human being and a citizen. The language was carefully chosen, stressing legality, respectability, and legitimate self-defense. Eleanor was making a public record of her position, so that if violence came, there would be proof of her attempt to avoid it, while asserting her right to exist. Did she ever send this letter? Dr. Mitchell asked. Patricia shook her head. I don't think so. I think she wrote it to clarify her own mind, to put her position into words. But Grandma Clara told me that Eleanor did something else with it. She showed it to her pastor, Reverend William Hayes, and asked him to keep a copy. She wanted someone outside the family to know her intentions, to have a record of what she was facing. And the photograph? Dr. Mitchell asked, though she was beginning to understand. Patricia nodded. Grandma said Eleanor had the photograph made specifically to send to the men who had threatened her. She wanted them to see her face, to see her daughters, and to see that she was armed and unafraid. She had the photographer make 6 copies. She kept one for herself, gave one to Reverend Hayes, and personally delivered 4 others to the men she knew were behind the threats. Dr. Mitchell was surprised. She knew who they were. The black community in Worcester was small. People talked. Everyone knew who was on that citizens' committee, who had been involved in driving other families out. Eleanor found out their names and where they lived, and she made sure they each received a copy of that photograph. What happened after that? Dr. Mitchell asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Patricia's expression darkened. 2 weeks later they came for her. According to Clara's detailed account, as preserved through family oral history, and now shared by Patricia, the weeks following the photograph's delivery in mid-September 1899 were tense, but outwardly quiet. Eleanor continued her seamstress work, though several of her regular white clients suddenly canceled their standing orders, offering no explanations. New clients stopped coming. The economic pressure was deliberate, an attempt to force Eleanor into financial trouble that would make her sell the house. The 3 daughters attended the small school for black children on the east side of Worcester, about a mile from Cedar Street. Eleanor walked them to school each morning and picked them up each afternoon, never allowing them to travel alone. She kept the revolver, a .32 caliber Smith & Wesson, that she had purchased legally from a firearms dealer in Boston, loaded and within reach at all times. At night, she slept in the front room of the house rather than in her bedroom upstairs, positioning herself between any potential threat and her daughters. On the night of October 17, 1899, 4 men approached Eleanor's house just after midnight. Clara, then 7 years old, woke to the sound of shattering glass. Someone had thrown a large rock through the front window. The rock landed in the center of the front room, wrapped in paper that bore a single word written in black paint. Tonight, Eleanor was already awake, sitting in the front room in darkness, her revolver in her lap, positioned exactly as she had been in the photograph taken 5 weeks earlier. She had been expecting this. She did not light a lamp. She did not call out. She moved quietly to the staircase and whispered up to her daughters, telling them to stay in the back bedroom no matter what they heard, and to stay away from the windows. Ruth, the oldest at 14, gathered her younger sisters, Clara and Grace, in the back bedroom as instructed. They huddled together in the darkness, listening to the sounds from outside. Men's voices, harsh and angry, shouting for Eleanor to come out. Footsteps on the porch. The sound of someone testing the front door, finding it locked. Then the men began pounding on the door, demanding Eleanor open it. When she remained silent, they threatened to break it down. Eleanor, still in darkness, moved to a position behind the heavy wooden table she had positioned earlier near the door. She called out once, her voice steady. "This is my home. You are trespassing. Leave now, or I will defend my property." The response was laughter and more threats. Then one of the men began forcing the door with a heavy tool, probably a crowbar or an axe handle. The door frame began to splinter. Eleanor aimed her revolver at the center of the door and fired once. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet punched through the door at chest height, and outside, there was sudden silence, then cursing, and the sound of men scrambling back from the porch. For several minutes, Nothing happened. Clara would later recall the terrible silence, broken only by her own terrified breathing and Grace's quiet crying. Ruth held both her sisters, whispering prayers. Then they smelled smoke. The men had moved to the sides and back of the house, and were throwing lit torches onto the roof and against the wooden siding. Eleanor faced an impossible choice: stay inside and risk her daughters burning to death, or go outside and confront armed men who Ruth intended to harm her family. She chose the only option that might save her children. She ran upstairs, gathered Ruth, Grace, and Clara, and led them down to the back door. She told Ruth to run with her sisters directly to Reverend Hayes's house, 3 blocks away, to stay off the main streets, and not to look back. Ruth, though terrified, did as her mother commanded. She took Clara's hand, made sure Grace stayed close, and ran into the darkness. Eleanor watched until they disappeared around the corner. Then she returned to the front of the house, revolver in hand, and stepped out onto the porch. The 4 men stood at the property line, visible in the growing firelight. They had expected her to flee, or to be trapped inside, but they had not expected her to come out armed and facing them directly. For a long, frozen moment, no one moved. The Worcester Fire Department responded to the blaze within 15 minutes. Remarkably fast response time for 1899. By the time the horse-drawn fire wagon arrived, the roof of Eleanor's house was fully engulfed in flames, and fire was spreading down the walls. Firefighters immediately began working to contain the blaze and prevent it from spreading to neighboring houses. They found Eleanor standing in her front yard, revolver clearly visible in her hand, facing 4 white men who stood roughly 20 feet away at the edge of her property. The standoff had frozen everyone in place. None of the men had fled when they heard the fire wagon approaching, which suggested a degree of confidence that they would not face consequences. 2 police officers arrived shortly after the fire brigade. What happened next would decide everything that followed: whether Eleanor would be arrested for holding a weapon, whether the 4 men would face any accountability, or whether the entire incident would be dismissed as a dispute with no charges filed against anyone. The critical factor was the arrival of Reverend William Hayes. Patricia explained the background. Reverend Hayes was an exceptional man. He was black, but he had served as a chaplain in a white Union regiment during the Civil War, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. He had kept relationships with several white veterans from that regiment, men who had fought alongside black soldiers and who, unlike most white people of that era, genuinely respected black people's humanity and rights. When Eleanor had first received threats in August, she had gone to Reverend Hayes for advice. He had given her practical suggestions: document everything, create evidence of the threats, make your case public through trusted witnesses, and if violence comes, make absolutely certain there are credible witnesses present who can testify to what actually happened. On the night of October 17th, after Ruth arrived at his house with her terrified sisters, Reverend Hayes immediately understood what was happening. He sent his wife to care for the girls. Then he ran to fetch 2 specific men, Captain James Morrison and Lieutenant Henry Fisher, both white veterans of the 54th Massachusetts, who lived in Worcester and who had remained friends with Reverend Hayes for over 30 years. These men had social standing, credibility, and most importantly, they were known to be honest. The 3 of them arrived at Eleanor's house just before the police. They witnessed the entire scene. Eleanor standing in her yard, armed but not threatening anyone, simply holding her ground. 4 white men with torches, some of which were still burning, and Eleanor's house engulfed in flames. Captain Morrison immediately approached the police officers and identified himself, then calmly described what he and his companions had witnessed upon arrival. The presence of 2 respected white veterans changed the entire situation. The police could not simply dismiss the incident or arrest only Eleanor. They took statements from everyone present, and under Captain Morrison's insistence, they arrested all 4 white men on charges of arson and attempted assault. The 4 defendants were Thomas Bradford, the chairman of the Citizens Committee who had been quoted in the newspaper, his son Richard, age 26, James Morris, a local merchant, and Albert Clark, a factory foreman. They were represented by expensive legal counsel and immediately posted bail. Their defense strategy was predictable. They claimed they had gone to Eleanor's house merely to negotiate a final offer to purchase her property, and that she had fired upon them without cause, causing them to flee in fear. The fire, they suggested, had been started by an overturned lamp inside the house, implying Eleanor had set it herself, either accidentally or on purpose. The trial took place in December 1899, at Worcester County Court. Newspaper coverage was limited and dismissive. The Worcester Daily Gazette ran a brief item, noting that 4 men were tried for property destruction related to a dispute involving a colored woman on Cedar Street. But Reverend Hayes, understanding the historical importance of the case, kept detailed personal notes of the proceedings. Eleanor testified in her own defense. No transcript of her testimony survives, but Reverend Hayes recorded that she spoke for nearly an hour, calmly and precisely. She presented the threatening letters as evidence. She testified about the pattern of intimidation against black homeowners in Worcester, including the 1898 arson that had driven another family away. She explained her decision to commission the photograph, with a revolver visible, not as a threat, but as documentation of her reasonable fear and her legal right to self-defense. Most dramatically, Captain Morrison and Lieutenant Fisher testified. They described arriving at the scene and witnessing 4 men with torches and a burning house, with Eleanor standing in her yard, having clearly defended her property and sent her children to safety. They testified that Eleanor had not threatened anyone, had not moved toward the men, and had simply stood her ground on her own property. The jury, made up entirely of white men, as was legally required in Massachusetts at that time, deliberated for 3 hours. The verdict was guilty on charges of arson and attempted assault. The judge sentenced each defendant to 6 months in the county jail and fines of $200 each. Large sums, but far less than the maximum penalties allowed under law. For 1899, however, any conviction at all of white men for crimes against a black victim was very unusual. Eleanor had won her case, but the cost was huge. The house on Cedar Street was badly damaged by the fire. The entire roof had been destroyed, and water from the firefighting efforts had ruined much of the inside structure, furniture, and Eleanor's sewing equipment. The house was technically still standing, but it was uninhabitable and would require major repairs. Eleanor filed an insurance claim with the National Property Insurance Company, which had issued her a homeowner's policy when she purchased the property in 1895. The company sent an adjuster to examine the damage in late October. In early November, Eleanor received a letter denying her claim. The reason given was that the fire had been caused by civil unrest and racial conflict related to the presence in a white neighborhood, an exclusion clause in the policy that basically blamed her for being the victim of a hate crime. The company argued that because the fire had been deliberately set during a dispute rather than being an accident, the policy did not apply. Eleanor hired an attorney, a black lawyer from Boston, who took the case without fee and challenged the denial. The legal process dragged on for months. Meanwhile, Eleanor faced the immediate problem of having 3 daughters to house and feed with no home, damaged equipment, and a business that had effectively ended as all her remaining white clients had left her. The black community in Worcester, though small and economically struggling itself, organized to help. Reverend Hayes led a fundraising effort. They held church suppers, where people paid small amounts for meals, with all proceeds going to Eleanor's house fund. They collected donations after Sunday services. They reached out to sympathetic white allies, including Captain Morrison and Lieutenant Fisher, who contributed and encouraged others to do so. Over 6 weeks, the community raised $300, an extraordinary sum, representing hundreds of small donations from people who had very little themselves. Eleanor contributed the remaining $80 from her personal savings, and by February 1900, she had enough to hire contractors to repair the house. The work was completed in April 1900, but Eleanor understood that Worcester would never be safe for her family. The 4 convicted men had been released from jail after serving only 4 months of their 6-month sentences, shortened for good behavior. The Bradford family and their allies remained influential in the city. Thomas Bradford's business continued to operate successfully. He faced no social consequences for his actions. Threats continued, though more quietly now. Ruth, now 15, reported being followed home from school by groups of white boys who called her bad names, but never quite crossed the line into physical assault. Grace, 12, was refused entry to the public library by a clerk who claimed colored patrons were only allowed on certain days, a rule that did not officially exist, but was enforced anyway. Clara, 8 years old, was pushed down on the street by older white children, while adults watched without helping. Eleanor made her decision in March 1900. She would sell the house and move her family to Boston, where a larger and more established black community offered some measure of safety and numbers. She found a black family, recently arrived from Georgia, who were looking for a home in Worcester, and were unaware of the dangers. Eleanor sold them the house for $650, nearly $200 less than she had paid for it 5 years earlier. But she made sure to tell them the complete history of what had happened. The family, having already experienced worse violence in the South, decided to take the risk. They believed the fact that 4 white men had been convicted might actually offer them some protection, as it established legal precedent that black homeowners had rights. Eleanor used the $650 to relocate to Boston's South End, where she rented a modest apartment in a building owned by a black landlord. She restarted her seamstress business, this time working almost exclusively for black clients, and a small number of progressive white families and abolitionist circles who sought her out, specifically because they had heard about her case. The work was steady, though less profitable than her Worcester business had been at its peak. Eleanor never owned property again. The trauma of Worcester had taught her that visibility and economic success could be deadly for black families in America. Ruth, Grace, and Clara all survived to adulthood. Growing up in Boston's black community, Ruth became a school teacher, teaching at the elementary school for black children in Roxbury. Grace married a postal worker and raised 4 children. Clara, Patricia's grandmother, worked as a housekeeper for a white family in Cambridge, and later raised 5 children of her own, including Patricia's mother. Eleanor lived until 1932, dying at age 71 during the early years of the Great Depression. She had lived to see her daughters grow, marry, and have children. She never returned to Worcester, not even once. According to Clara, Eleanor rarely spoke about what had happened there, but she kept the 1899 photograph, the one with the revolver visible in her lap, in her Bible, until the day she died. It was found there by Clara when she went through her mother's belongings after the funeral. Dr. Sarah Mitchell spent the weeks following her meetings with Patricia, placing Eleanor's story within the broader framework of post-Civil War black history in America. What had happened to Eleanor was not an isolated incident, but part of a planned nationwide effort of racial terror designed to limit black economic and social progress. Even in northern states that had ended slavery decades earlier, research into Worcester's demographic history revealed clear patterns. Between 1890 and 1910, the city's black population remained remarkably stable at approximately 600 people, less than half of 1% of the total population, which grew from 85,000 to over 145,000 during the same period. This stability was not natural demographic slowdown. It was the result of deliberate exclusion. Black families who tried to settle in Worcester faced organized resistance that either drove them away or prevented them from coming at all. Dr. Mitchell discovered documentation of at least 5 separate organizations formed by white Worcester residents between 1890 and 1920 with the clear purpose of preventing black families from buying homes in white neighborhoods. These organizations had formal membership, elected leadership, regular meetings, and coordinated strategies. They were not fringe groups, but included respected businessmen, professionals, and civic leaders. Their activities included organizing boycotts of black-owned businesses, pressuring white businesses not to serve black customers, pooling money to outbid black buyers on property sales, lobbying city officials to refuse building permits for black homeowners, and when all else failed, resorting to intimidation and violence. This pattern was not unique to Worcester. Dr. Mitchell examined historical records from dozens of northern cities and found nearly identical situations. In Springfield, Massachusetts, the black population actually declined between 1890 and 1910, despite the city's overall growth. In Hartford, Connecticut, black home ownership rates dropped sharply during the same period, even as the black population grew slightly. In Providence, Rhode Island, black families were effectively limited to a single neighborhood through a combination of restrictive agreements, lending discrimination, and organized harassment. The violence Eleanor faced was part of a national wave of racial terror. During the 1890s and early 1900s, thousands of black families across America were driven from their homes and communities through arson, mob violence, and economic pressure. In the South, this period saw the height of lynching. Nearly 2,000 documented lynchings occurred between 1889 and 1918, the vast majority of victims being black men, though black women, and even children, were also murdered by white mobs. Jim Crow laws were systematically put in place across the South, legally setting racial segregation and black subordination. In the North, the violence was less obvious, but still widespread. Rather than public shows of lynching, Northern racial terror took the form of targeted attacks on individual families, economic pressure, and legal tricks. The goal was the same: to keep white supremacy and prevent black economic progress. Northern white people often felt proud of being less racist than Southerners, but the practical results were remarkably similar. Black people were limited to certain neighborhoods, certain jobs, and certain social positions with violence or economic ruin, waiting for those who challenged these boundaries. What made Eleanor's case special was not that she faced threats and violence that was sadly common, but that she successfully fought back within the legal system and won a conviction against her attackers. Dr. Mitchell's research revealed that convictions of white people for crimes against black victims in northern states during this period were very rare. Most cases were never prosecuted at all. Police and prosecutors routinely chose not to pursue charges, claiming insufficient evidence or dismissing incidents as disputes rather than crimes. When cases did go to trial, all white juries almost always freed white defendants no matter the evidence. Eleanor's successful prosecution resulted from a unique set of factors: the credibility provided by white Union veteran witnesses, whose reputations made it impossible for the jury to dismiss their testimony; the organizational support of Reverend Hayes and the black community, who ensured proper documentation and legal representation; Eleanor's own smart thinking in creating evidence of the threats through the photograph and preserved letters, and perhaps a degree of luck in drawing a judge and jury who were willing to convict despite common racial attitudes. Dr. Mitchell also researched the revolver itself. Smith & Wesson .32 caliber revolvers were widely available during the 1890s and were specifically marketed to women for self-defense. Advertisements from the period show firearms companies promoting small caliber revolvers as ladies' protection against burglars and assailants. For a woman, white or black, to own such a weapon was not particularly unusual. What was special was Eleanor's willingness to show it publicly, and if necessary, use it against white men. Black people who defended themselves against white attackers were routinely prosecuted for assault or murder, even when acting in clear self-defense. Eleanor's decision to arm herself and to make that fact known was therefore both practical and politically strong, an assertion of her right to exist, to own property, and to protect her family, no matter white opposition. On June 15, 2024, the Boston Historical Society opened a special exhibition titled Eleanor, Portrait of Resistance, 1899. The exhibition took up the museum's main gallery and had been designed in close cooperation with Patricia Johnson and her extended family. Dr. Sarah Mitchell served as lead curator and had spent 3 months gathering historical materials, writing explanatory texts, and designing the display to honor Eleanor's courage while placing her story in proper historical context. The main item of the exhibition was the 1899 photograph, displayed under museum quality, lighting and climate control. Beside it, a high-resolution magnified detail clearly showed the revolver in Eleanor's lap with explanatory text, describing what it was and why it was there. The threatening letters Eleanor had received were displayed in protective cases alongside Eleanor's handwritten response. Reverend Hayes's trial notes were presented in full, allowing visitors to read first-hand accounts of the proceedings. Maps showed Cedar Street, in 1899 Worcester, photographs of the city during that era, and demographic data illustrating the tiny size of Worcester's black community. Newspaper articles from the period were copied, showing the racist language and documenting the organized campaign against black homeowners. The exhibition also included the 1927 photograph of elderly Eleanor, showing visitors that she had survived and lived nearly 3 more decades. Family documents traced what had happened to Ruth, Grace, and Clara, how all 3 had built lives, raised families, and contributed to their communities despite the trauma they had faced. A family tree showed Eleanor's descendants, now numbering more than 40 people across 4 generations. Patricia attended the opening with 17 members of her extended family, Eleanor's descendants meeting in many cases for the first time. The photograph had brought them together. Many had known pieces of the family story, but had never heard the full account or seen the documentary evidence that confirmed it was all true. Dr. Mitchell gave the opening presentation to a crowd of over 200 people, museum members, historians, journalists, community leaders, and members of the public who had heard about the author, discovery, and wanted to understand its meaning. She spoke for 30 minutes, carefully walking through Eleanor's story, explaining the historical context, and describing why this photograph and this story mattered for understanding American history. This photograph, Dr. Freichel explained, is a primary source document that reveals truths often removed from official historical records. Eleanor's decision to hold that revolver in her lap, to have it photographed, and to send copies to the men who threatened her, was an act of great courage. She understood that her family's survival depended on making it absolutely clear she would not be an easy victim. By preserving this image, she left evidence for future generations, for us to understand what black families endured and how they resisted. Eleanor's story is both special and typical. It is special because she successfully defended herself and achieved a measure of justice in court, outcomes that were sadly rare for black families in 1899. It is typical because the violence, discrimination, and terror she faced were common experiences for millions of black Americans during this period, in both the South and the North. Her story gives us insight into the daily reality of black life after the Civil War, a reality of constant threat, of having to be always watchful, of knowing that success and visibility could be deadly. The exhibition received wide media coverage. Major newspapers and magazines ran features on Eleanor's story, often using the photograph as their lead image. NPR produced a radio documentary. Several history podcasts devoted episodes to discussing the case and its implications. Academic historians of African American life in New England began using the photograph and associated documents in their research and teaching. For Patricia and her family, however, the exhibition provided something more personal than academic recognition. It provided validation and reclamation. For so long, Patricia told a reporter from the Boston Globe, "Our family history was just oral tradition. We knew these stories, but we had no proof, no documentation that would make other people believe us. Grandma Clara would tell me about her mother's courage, but there was always this sense that maybe she was exaggerating, or maybe memory had changed things over time. Now we have proof. Now everyone can see what my great-great-grandmother faced, and how she refused to be broken. That photograph is her testimony. And finally, people are listening." The 1899 portrait of Eleanor and her daughters, once nearly thrown away as worthless in an estate sale, now resides in the permanent collection of the Boston Historical Society, added as a major acquisition in American historical photography. It has been digitized and is available for educational use. Multiple universities have requested permission to include it in their curriculum materials. On post-Civil War African American history, the history of racism in the North, and the history of black resistance and resilience. The photograph stands as a testament to one woman's courage, to the violence and systematic racism of the post-Civil War era, and to the power of black families to survive, resist, and preserve their stories against overwhelming odds. The revolver hidden in Eleanor's lap, barely visible to the casual observer, but unmistakably present to those who look closely, has become one of the most powerful symbols in American photographic history. A mother's promise to protect her children, captured forever in silver and light. A declaration that she would not be moved, would not be intimidated, and would not surrender what she had built through her own labor and courage. Eleanor's house on Cedar Street in Worcester no longer stands. It was demolished in the 1960s, during urban renewal. But her photograph endures, and through it, her voice still speaks, across 125 years, testifying to the reality of Black life in America, and the fierce determination of those who refuse to accept injustice as inevitable.